Okay, this will be a quick overview of the static and dynamic characteristics of signals lab, lab week 2 in ME and AE 201. We're going to be working on an on-off fluid level controller, and we're going to be using that Arduino IoT system with our calibrated moisture sensor. We're going to take a look at an example of what to expect from this project from student demos from last year. We see a tank that has water in it. We can add some water. Water goes up, and ultimately, we want to be able to control a pump uh, set at 1.5 inches plus or minus a quarter inch. We want to be able to turn on a pump to pump excess water out when the water gets too high, using that Arduino, using a dashboard and a feedback loop. We're also going to make a Christmas tree light. That's a form of an output display, green and red lights corresponding to the water level as well. So all of this will be part of Lab Week 2. So this is the agenda for week 2. We will touch base on the water height sensor calibration from week 1, and then we'll get into and do most of this experiment, hopefully in lab, and we'll hopefully record some demos. There's a little bit of post-lab that's about signal processing with Fourier analysis as well. The graphic for this lab is shown here. Picture a greenhouse. Urban farming is the concept. And in this greenhouse, there's a tank that has water. Water is being filled in from this rain barrel that's passively dripping water in. And we would like to regulate it. If the water gets too high, we want to be able to pump some extra water out. We want to be able to have this tank be able to grow plants, a hydroponic garden. We also want to simulate environmental controls such as a fan and then lights for greenhouse growing. So this is analogous to something that we could do for a classroom garden where we might, over the course of a year in school, grow some plants and need to regulate water level in that tank, or maybe a wastewater treatment plant where on a heavy rain day, those tanks fill up and the tanks along the river could end up with some pollution. So what if we have a way of detecting if water's too high and pumping it out to an auxiliary holding tank if need be? So this lab is all a part of the measurement systems introduction. We looked at sensors, transducers, signal paths, and output in the last lab and talked about signals going through them. We also talked about the idea of having control or feedback loops in our measurement systems and calibration, which we implemented with the moisture sensor last week. So chapter 2 discusses the characteristics of both the input signals to the measurement system and the resulting output signals. The shape and form of a signal are referred to as a waveform, and that waveform contains the information about the magnitude, which is about the size of the input quantity, and the frequency, which indicates the rate of change in time of the signal. So an understanding of these waveforms is important for selection and use and interpretation of measurement system data. We'll see about that in this lab and see if the signals are reliable as we process through the moisture sensor, through the Arduino, through a cloud dashboard to ultimately achieve a simple objective. Now, signals can be classified in different ways, and the simplest of which is an analog signal. Our moisture sensor starts out as an analog signal, and then because it is converted from an analog to digital converter in the Arduino, it becomes a digital signal because it's discrete in time and in amplitude or quantity. A signal could also just be discrete in time with an analog amplitude and then just sampled in time at fixed frequencies. So the moisture sensor was a part of our signal conditioning system, also our sensor and transducer in one. This moisture sensor is pretty cool because it really has a little 555 timer that generates a square wave. That square wave, which is at high frequency, then becomes a sawtooth proportional to the capacitance of that moisture sensor. That capacitance probe is part of an RC filter. That waveform then goes to a peak detector using a diode for rectifying that signal to get a nice stable analog output proportional to moisture or water level. Well, how do we use that signal to actually control an appliance? Well, analogous to water level control is thermostat control, something for environmental controls in a room that we're all familiar with. Set the room to 68 degrees, and then the furnace kicks on if it gets too cool. So this simply uses a relay to turn on and off an appliance where we keep track of a set point and an error, and then we have an error tolerance to run that appliance. In this case, there's a on-off control loop that has four discrete state pairs. And so those are the deadband where the control state is off and we stay off while the error changes. And then we go from off to turn on. And then we go from on to stay on and then on to turn off. We need to capture the logic in that controller in a set of nested if-then statements. And then we use that to keep track of the state of the pump, the state of the air, and then turn on and off the relays as needed. In our case, we'll use the relays for turning on and off a pump to regulate water level. So we're going to be using that IoT maker carrier measurement system, but we're going to be adding in a pump, some tubing, a tank, a fan, and a few other components that will be part of our test equipment list that you'll pick up in lab. That's going to also include using the PC with Wi-Fi enabled and also the Moodle site and a cloud dashboard. This is what our apparatus looks like. We'll have a beaker of water that we're filling up, it's basically our auxiliary or holding tank, as we pour water into a funnel, simulating essentially rain dripping in an unregulated way while we control fluid level. There's going to be a step-by-step procedure. We'll work through this in lab, and hopefully this will allow us to be successful in assignment 2. And what we're going to be doing is replicating an urban farming thing, sketch, and dashboard in the Arduino cloud. We'll set some variables and then make up a dashboard that looks something like this. We'll also try to set this up to be wireless or over the air, and we'll connect in some relays to turn on that pump and fan. We'll sometimes use a breadboard for some of the wiring as needed, and then we'll modify the existing dashboard and thing with some variables for the height set point, and the error tolerance, making a dashboard that looks something like this. We'll demonstrate that along the way, and that's going to involve setting up variables with various types, various definitions, and various update rates, including whether they are updated as they change or at a fixed sample rate. The moisture sensor calibration from lab week 1 might have looked something like this, and it's obviously not perfectly linear. So we can linearize that by taking the log of both sides. What we're going to end up doing is replicating or redoing our moisture sensor calibration in lab this week with the tank that we have in place. And so we'll get a little more improved version of our calibration now that we know a little bit more how to do some of this analysis. We're going to retake height to moisture readings as we add water to the tank. We'll compute logs of both, and then we'll compute the slope and intercept of those log-log relationships, so that then ultimately we can get a height variable that's more accurate than just using the raw value. So we're also going to add a cool little output gauge that's basically a conditional gauge that's called a Christmas tree gauge, where these LEDs around the perimeter of the IoT maker carrier go from red to green as we go up and down in water level. The on-off control logic is something that we're going to have to work through and think through as we implement this logic using this pseudocode or if-then logic in the C++ C Arduino environment for coding. Ultimately, a lot of what we do in experimental work is troubleshooting and diagnosing issues. And so to get this thing working, it's going to be some trial and error, and there's some step-by-step procedures, but also some tips for working out if one issue is occurring, whether the code is not working right, or the fan, or the pump, or some other system. We have tips for how to get through that. Lastly, the signal analysis post-lab will involve looking at and computing an RMS value, which characterizes the dynamic or AC portion of a signal, and then also looking at periodic signals, those that have some frequency component. For instance, if the water tank were to be moving up and down, maybe if it's being jostled maybe going over the road or maybe on board a ship or something like that, it might have some dynamic characteristic. If it's periodic, it might have a fixed frequency. If it's aperiodic, it doesn't have a clear, repeatable interval. And if it's non-deterministic, it has no discernible pattern, maybe looks like noise. Well, that dives into frequency analysis, where we can look at a signal from its frequency components or frequency spectrum, kind of like a prism, or when we think of looking at the various modes of vibration for a plucked string, we can take a look at the frequency amplitude of a signal and detect certain high frequency or high amplitude frequency peaks, maybe corresponding to a noise source that we might want to control or be aware of in some case. So we're going to get some experience with Fourier series and Fourier transforms by doing a little tutorial using a cool little user interface that allows us to explore Fourier analysis in a concise way in a post lab. So we'll be using a little pump like this in lab, but when we get to the Fourier analysis part, we'll actually be looking at a GUI that looks like this for Fourier transforms, where we look at sine, square waves, and triangle waves in the frequency spectrum. And then we'll also be looking at a Fourier series lab, where we try to approximate a square wave with a series of summed up sine waves at different frequencies. So here what I'm doing is I'm increasing the amplitude of various components of sine waves that all are adding up to closely approximate a square wave, as shown here by the sum of deviations squared, the difference between the blue and the black lines. This type of Fourier analysis is part of signal processing, and it's really a part of understanding static and dynamic characteristics of signals. Now, back in this lab, we really actually have a very cool project, and we're going to see that the signals processing through this measurement system are going to be things that allow us, in some cases, to work effectively for this job of regulating fluid level. And then in some cases, some of the signal processing and signal characteristics actually might make it difficult to do this otherwise simple operation. So that's the quick intro. The next thing we're going to look at is all the test equipment that we're going to use for this lab. See you then.